Hi, my name is Amy Beesalm Medford, and I'm a researcher at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. I'm here with Monte Mills, and we are introducing a new series, a collaboration between the Harvard Project and the Native Nation Center at the University of Oklahoma to look at the implications of McGirt and how that might affect the tribes in Oklahoma and the rest of Indian country. Mr. Mills, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, Amy. My name's Monte Mills. I'm a professor and director of the Marjorie Hunter Brown Indian Law Clinic here at the Alexander Blewett III School of Law at the University of Montana.
Great. So Monty, one of the first policy briefs that we're going to be releasing is on cultural resources. And in it, you did a great job of sort of laying out the context around cultural resources and what leads up to the Native American Graves Protection Act. Would you be able to give us a little bit of context there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the term cultural resources is really broad, and I think a lot of people think about cultural resources in many different ways. Really unfortunately, the history of the legal treatment of cultural resources of Indigenous people has been really focused on the interests of outside parties. So historically, the federal government really looked at archaeological resources or scientific resources instead of the cultural values that Indigenous folks have in either places or specific items or even locations or even worse, human remains and the remains of their ancestors. And it was really that latter category that brought about a significant movement, particularly in the 70s and 80s, among tribes and tribal leaders to push for additional protection and recognition of Native American graves and associated funerary and as well as other cultural items. And that's what led to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which was eventually enacted by Congress in 1990. And unlike sort of the historical treatment of all of those important items, NAGPRA signaled an important shift in recognizing the tribal connection to both ancestors and cultural items and put tribes in the position of getting to decide, ideally, where and how those resources would be protected and kept. And there have certainly been challenges in implementing NAGPRA in the last 30 years, but I think it really marked a beginning of a shift toward tribal leadership around protecting those important resources.
Right. In your paper, you mentioned some of the specific investments that some of the five tribes in Oklahoma have implemented themselves, and maybe areas that they might want to expand into. Would you be able to expand a little bit on those, and maybe what would tribes outside of Oklahoma want to consider investing in themselves?
Yeah, sure. And sort of in conjunction with NAGPRA, there have also been recent changes in the National Historic Preservation Act and other laws, again, led by tribal voices in sort of recognizing the tribal role in protecting these resources. Um, in that context, the changes in the National Historic Preservation Act, the NHPA, enabled and authorized tribes to develop tribal historic preservation offices and then basically take on additional authority for consultation with the federal government and involvement in these procedures. And that's what a number of tribes have done, including some of the five tribes in Oklahoma, is establish those tribal historic preservation offices, or THIPOs. And really, as discussed in much more detail in the paper, I think the opportunities presented by the Supreme Court's confirmation of historical reservation boundaries in McGirt is to build on those efforts that the tribes have already been engaged in. And I think that's really the opportunity and potential lesson for tribes outside of Oklahoma, is thinking about innovative ways to build on existing practices of sovereignty and the existing avenues through under federal law through which tribes can exert additional influence. And, tribes in Oklahoma have been on the forefront of that movement in a lot of ways. And I think the McGirt decision just opened some new doors for them to pursue that further.
And in the paper, you mentioned that there was, because of the new establishment of the boundaries, that the TIPO officers might be more in line with an identification of the state equivalent. Um, how does that change what they might do?
Yeah, well, both in NAGPRA and in the NHPA, the definition of tribal lands, which really sort of establishes some of the boundaries of tribal authority, is rooted in the definition of Indian country under federal law, which relies on reservation boundaries. And so, with the Supreme Court's confirmation of those historical boundaries for the five tribes, both under NHPA and under NAGPRA, those authorities are confirmed to those historical reservation boundaries. With regard to the THIPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers under NHPA, the act does provide that those THIPOs can exercise, sort of fulfill the role of what had been done by the state historical preservation officer within those boundaries, subject to some caveats. And really what that opens the door to is, whereas historically in the five tribes area, the authority of a THIPO or the responsibility, say, of a federal agency to ensure consultation with the THIPO might have been somewhat limited to tribal lands or other areas of tribal interest. It really confirms that within the whole reservation boundary, without regard to land ownership, the tribe and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer is an important official and may even be the official instead of the state historic preservation officer with whom the federal government needs to consult and who can make important decisions about historic preservation activities within that area. So that, as I said, there have already been THIPOs within the five tribes and they've already been doing this work. I think McGirt really just confirms a broader scope and more potential opportunity for those efforts to continue.
Yeah, that's really great. I think one of the points that came up in the paper as well was a resource of a book that you've already published with co-author, and I think that that's also a great resource for Indian country to get into.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I hope, my co-author and I, Hillary Hoffman from Vermont Law School, really intended it to be a resource for anybody interested in these issues, thinking about the future, and particularly for tribes and tribal leaders, tribal voices to move those efforts forward.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Monty. And if you would like any more information, please visit the McGirt Toolbox with the link below.
Thanks, Amy.